This is section 78 of Mark Twain Speaking. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Punch Brothers Punch, read on World Tour programs 1895 to 1896, and on other occasions. Read by John Greenman. When the conductor receives a fare, he will punch in the presence of the passenger. You bought a blue slip or trip slip for the longest distance, 8 cents. A buff trip slip, shorter distance, 6 cents. Pink, shortest distance, 3 cents. These facts were displayed in large print, line after line, like a frieze around under the ceiling of the car. It struck some newspaper man that they would make poetry if bunched together. So he bunched them together, and then they read, "Conductor, when you receive a fare, punch in the presence of the passenger. A blue trip slip for an 8-cent fare, a buff trip slip for a 6-cent fare, a pink trip slip for a 3-cent fare. Punch in the presence of the passenger." Chorus, "Punch, brothers, punch with care, punch in the presence of the passenger." I came across these jingling rhymes in the newspaper and read them a couple of times. They took instant and entire possession of me. All through breakfast they went waltzing through my brain, and when, at last, I was finished, I could not tell whether I had eaten anything or not. I went to my desk and took up my pen, but it was no use. My head kept humming, "A blue trip slip for an 8-cent fare, a buff trip slip for a 6-cent fare, a pink," etc. Punch in the presence. I suffered all the afternoon, suffered all through an unconscious and unrefreshing dinner, suffered and cried and jingled all through the evening, went to bed and rolled, tossed, and jingled right along, the same as ever. Got up at midnight, frantic, and tried to read, but there was nothing visible upon the whirling page except punch, punch in the presence of the passenger. 2 days later, on Saturday morning, I arose, a tottering wreck, and went forth to fulfill an engagement with a valued friend, the Reverend Mr. —, to walk to the Talcott Tower, 10 miles distant. He stared at me, but asked no questions. We started. Mr. talked, 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 as is his wont. I said nothing. I heard nothing. Busy with my jingles. At the 10-mile post, all of a sudden, Mr. laid his hand on my shoulder and shouted, "Oh, wake up! Wake up! Wake up! Don't sleep all day! Here we are at the tower, man! I have talked myself deaf and dumb and blind and never got a response. Just look at this magnificent autumn landscape. Look at it! Look at it! Feast your eyes on it! You have traveled. You have seen boasted landscapes elsewhere. Come, now, deliver an honest opinion. What do you say to this?" I sighed wearily and murmured, "A buff trip slip for a 6-cent fare, a pink trip slip for a 3-cent fare. Punch in the presence of the passenger." Reverend Mr. stood there, very grave, full of concern, apparently, and looked long at me. Then he said, "Mark, there is something about this that I cannot understand. Those are about the same words you said before. There does not seem to be anything in them, and yet they nearly break my heart when you say them. Punch in the how is it they go?" I began at the beginning and repeated all the lines. My friend's face lighted with interest. He said, "Why, What a captivating jingle it is! It is almost music. It flows along so nicely. I have nearly caught the rhymes myself. Say them over just once more, and then I'll have them sure." I said them over. Then Mr. Blank said them. He made one little mistake, which I corrected. The next time, and the next, he got them right. Now a great burden seemed to tumble from my shoulders. That torturing jingle departed out of my brain, and a grateful sense of rest and peace descended upon me. Then my freed tongue found blessed speech again, and the pent talk of many a weary hour began to gush and flow. It flowed on and on, joyously, jubilantly, until the fountain was empty and dry. As I wrung my friend's hand at parting, I said, "Haven't we had a royal good time? But now I remember, you haven't said a word for 2 hours. Come, come, out with something." The Reverend Mr. turned a lackluster eye upon me, drew a deep sigh, and said, without animation, without apparent consciousness, "Punch, brothers, punch with care, punch in the presence of the passenger." A pang shot through me as I said to myself, "Oh, poor fellow, he has got it now." I did not see Mr. for 2 or 3 days after that. Then on Tuesday evening he staggered into my presence and slumped down, all in a pile, in a chair. He was pale, worn. He was a wreck. He lifted his faded eyes to my face and said, "Ah, Mark, it was a ruinous investment that I made in those heartless rhymes. They have ridden me like a nightmare, day and night, hour after hour, to this very moment. Since I saw you I have suffered the torments of the lost. Saturday evening I had a sudden call, by telegraph, and took the night train for Boston. The occasion was the death of a valued old friend who had requested that I should preach his funeral sermon. I took my seat in the cars and set myself to framing the discourse. But I never got beyond the opening paragraph. For then the train started, and the car wheels began their clack, 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 and right away those odious rhymes fitted themselves to the accompaniment. Clack, 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 a blue trip slip. Clack, 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 for an 8-cent fare. Clack, 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 a buff trip slip. Clack, 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 for a 6-cent fare, and so on, and so on, and so on. Punch in the presence of the passenger. Sleep? Not a single wink. I was almost a lunatic when I got to Boston. Don't ask me about the funeral. I did the best I could, but every solemn individual sentence was meshed and tangled and woven in and out with "Punch, brothers, punch with care, punch in the presence of the passenger," and the most distressing thing was that my delivery dropped into the undulating rhythm of those pulsing rhymes, and I could actually catch absent-minded people nodding time to the swing of it with their stupid heads. And mark, before I got through, the entire assemblage were placidly bobbing their heads in solemn unison, mourners, undertakers, and all. Before I had finished, I was in a state bordering on frenzy, and oh, 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 my closing remark, "He is gone from us, my friends and brethren, we shall never see him more. Haloed he sits with the happy choir singing, singing, punch, brothers, punch with care, punch in the presence of the passenger." End of Punch, Brothers, Punch, read by John Greenman. This is section 79 of Mark Twain Speaking. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Interview, Bombay, India, circa January 22, 1896. Read by John Greenman. The interviewer asked, "I presume you prepare carefully for your lectures?" "Yes, I am not for one moment going to pretend I do not. I don't believe that any public man has ever attained success as a lecturer to paid audiences (mark the qualification) who has not carefully prepared, and has not gone over every sentence again and again until the whole thing is fixed upon his memory. I write my lectures and try to memorize them, but I don't always succeed. If I had a better memory it would be worse in some respects, for when one has to fill up an ellipsis on the spot, there is a spontaneity about the thing which is a considerable relief. I ought really to write the whole thing beforehand, but I don't do it, as I prefer to use material which has appeared in my books. The extracts, however, are seldom exactly the same as they are printed, but are adapted to circumstances. No, I don't localize, because to do that you want to be well posted up and know exactly what you are about. You must be exactly prepared beforehand. I never pretend that I don't indent on my books for my lectures, for there is no object in doing that. It is all very well to talk about not being prepared and trusting to the spirit of the hour, but a man cannot go from one end of the world to the other, no matter how great his reputation may be, and stand before paid houses in various large cities, without finding that his tongue is far less glib than it used to be. He might hold audiences spellbound with unpremeditated oratory in past days, when nothing was charged to hear him, but he cannot rely on being able to do so when they have paid for their seats and require something for the money, unless he thinks all out beforehand. You ask me whether my memory has deserted me on the platform sometimes? Yes, it has sometimes entirely, and the worst of it is that, as I prefer to select things from my books, my remarks are often in the narrative form, and if you lose yourself in the narrative it is not very comfortable, because a tale should have an end somewhere. Still, I have generally managed to get out of the difficulty in some way or other. It is really very curious to see what a man can do on the platform without the audience suspecting anything to be wrong. A case in point occurred in Paris a year ago. I began some opening remarks at one of my at-homes there with an anecdote. As for some reason or another, I wanted to fill up the time. I began telling the anecdote, but I found when half-way that my memory regarding it had gone, so I switched on to another line, and was soon leaving the half-told anecdote far behind. My wife and daughter were present, and I afterwards asked them whether they remembered the breakdown. They replied in the negative. I then asked whether they heard the finish of the anecdote with which I had begun my remarks, and they at once replied they had not. As you say, if anyone would be likely to discover a flaw, it would be my wife or my daughter, and when I found that they were unaware of the defect, I was quite satisfied that the audience in general knew nothing about it. End of interview. Read by John Greenman. This is section 80 of Mark Twain speaking. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Dinner Speech. New Vagabonds Club Dinner for Mr. and Mrs. Clemens, London, June 29, 1899. Read by John Greenman. It has always been difficult. Leave that word difficult. Not exceedingly difficult, but just difficult. Nothing more than that. Not the slightest shade to add to that. Just difficult. To respond properly, in the right phraseology, when compliments are paid to me. But it is more than difficult when the compliments are paid to a better than I, my wife. And while I am not here to testify against myself, I can't be expected to do so. A prisoner in your own country is not admitted to do so. As to which member of the family wrote my books, I could say, in general, that really I wrote the books myself. My wife puts the facts in, and they make it respectable. My modesty won't suffer while compliments are being paid to literature, and through literature to my family. I can't get enough of them. I am curiously situated tonight. It so rarely happens that I am introduced by a humorist. I am generally introduced by a person of grave walk and carriage. That makes the proper background of gravity for brightness. I am going to alter to suit, and haply I may say some humorous things. When you start with a blaze of sunshine and upburst of humor, when you begin with that, the proper office of humor is to reflect, to put you into that pensive mood of deep thought, to make you think of your sins, if you wish half an hour to fly. Humor makes me reflect now tonight. It sets the thinking machinery in motion. Always, when I am thinking, there come suggestions of what I am, and what we all are, and what we are coming to. A sermon comes from my lips always when I listen to a humorous speech. I seize the opportunity to throw away frivolities, to say something to plant the seed, and make all better than when I came. In Mr. Grossmith's remarks there was a subtle something suggesting my favorite theory of the difference between theoretical morals and practical morals. I try to instill practical morals in the place of theoretical, but as an addendum, an annex, something added to theoretical morals. When your chairman said it was the first time he had ever taken the chair, he did not mean that he had not taken lots of other things. He attended my first lecture and took notes. This indicated the man's disposition. There was nothing else flying around, so he took notes. He would have taken anything he could get. I can bring a moral to bear here, which shows the difference between theoretical morals and practical morals. Theoretical morals are the sort you get on your mother's knee in good books and from the pulpit. You gather them in your head, and not in your heart. They are theory without practice. Without the assistance of practice to perfect them, it is difficult to teach a child to be honest, don't steal. I will teach you how it should be done, lead you into temptation, teach you how to steal, so that you may recognize when you have stolen and feel the proper pangs. It is no good going round and bragging that you have never taken the chair. As by the fires of experience, so by commission of crime you learn real morals. Commit all the crimes, familiarize yourself with all sins, take them in rotation. There are only 2,000 or 3,000 of them. Stick to it. Commit 2 or 3 every day, and by you will be proof against them. When you are through, you will be proof against all sins, and morally perfect. You will be vaccinated against every possible commission of them. This is the only way. I will read you a written statement upon the subject that I wrote 3 years ago to read to the Sabbath schools. Here the lecturer turned his pockets out, but without success. No, I have left it at home. Still, it was a mere statement of fact, illustrating the value of practical morals produced by the commission of crime. It was in my boyhood. Just a statement of fact. Reading is only more formal, merely facts, merely pathetic facts, which I can state so as to be understood. It relates to the first time I ever stole a watermelon. That is, I think it was the first time. Anyway, it was right along there somewhere. I stole it out of a farmer's wagon while he was waiting on another customer. Stole is a harsh term. I withdrew. I retired that watermelon. I carried it to a secluded corner of a lumber yard. I broke it open. It was green, the greenest watermelon raised in the valley that year. The minute I saw it was green, I was sorry, and began to reflect. Reflection is the beginning of reform. If you don't reflect when you commit a crime, then that crime is of no use. It might just as well have been committed by someone else. You must reflect, or the value is lost. You are not vaccinated against committing it again. I began to reflect. I said to myself, what ought a boy to do who has stolen a green watermelon? What would George Washington do, the father of his country, the only American who could not tell a lie? What would he do? Well, there is only one right, high, noble thing for any boy to do who has stolen a watermelon of that class. He must make restitution. He must restore that stolen property to its rightful owner. I said I would do it when I made that good resolution. I felt it to be a noble, uplifting obligation. I rose up spiritually stronger and refreshed. I carried that watermelon back, what was left of it, and restored it to the farmer, and made him give me a ripe one in its place. Now you see that this constant impact of crime upon crime protects you against further commission of crime. It builds you up. A man can't become morally perfect by stealing one or 1,000 green watermelons, but every little helps. I was at a great school yesterday, St. Paul's, where for 400 years they have been busy with brains and building up England by producing Pepys, Miltons, and Marlboroughs. 600 boys left to nothing in the world but theoretical morality. I wanted to become the professor of practical morality, but the high master was away, so I suppose I shall have to go on making my living the same old way, by adding practical to theoretical morality. What are the glory that was Greece, the grandeur that was Rome, compared to the glory and grandeur and majesty of a perfected morality such as you see before you? The new vagabonds are old vagabonds undergoing the old sort of reform. You drank my health. I hope I have not been unuseful. Take this system of morality to your hearts. Take it home to your neighbors and your graves, and I hope it will be a long time before you arrive there. End of dinner speech, read by John Greenman. This is section 81 of Mark Twain Speaking. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Remarks on Copyright. Select Committee Hearing, House of Lords, April 3, 1900. Read by John Greenman. I have been taxed by the British government for some years, and on investigation I found that my literature was taxed as gas works. That is literally true, and it hurt me. In my opinion, the copyright laws of England and America need only one commercially trifling, but morally gigantic, amendment to become perfect: the removal of the 42-year limit and the return to perpetual copyright. I consider that at least one of the reasons advanced in justification of the limited copyright is fallacious, namely, the one which makes a distinction between an author's property and real estate, and pretends that the two are not created, produced, or acquired in the same way, thus warranting a different treatment of the two by law. The limited copyright makes a distinction between an author's property and real estate, pretending that both are not created, produced, and acquired in the same way. The man who purchases a landed estate had to earn the money by the superiority of his intellect. A book is the result of an author's own brain in the same manner, a combination and exploitation of his ideas. When the copyright dies, it does not give the book to the publishers as a free gift. It merely gives the author's profit to the public. Out of every 100 tons of books sold, 99 are light literature. Therefore, to benefit the nation substantially, one would need to furnish it with the 99 tons as cheaply as possible. The other ton is of no consequence. My books are light literature, very light. Many unthinking thinkers think that copyright or the absence of it does not affect my books. Here they are sold at 2 shillings, and the destruction of the copyright could not cheapen them much more. certainly not enough to make the empire lose its sleep over the windfall. The public demand determines the price of a book, not Parliament or the publishers, who will make any honorable sacrifice that has money in it. The Bible is the only book possessing the fair and honorable grace of perpetual copyright, and that has not deprived the public of marvelously cheap editions. So few books outlive the 42 years limit that the small resulting profit to the state is not worth consideration. A limited copyright does not take enough pennies out of the author's pocket to make the thing worth while. Only 3 books written by Britons during this century have survived the 42-year limit, and the author's royalty on these books would net only about $32,500 a year, the sum the richest country on earth has taken from the pockets of the children of the little handful of illustrious men who had so great a share in building British power and broadening the world's civilization. Is it a matter for pride or congratulation that this ancient and mouldy wrong should be suffered to continue? I suggest that Parliament fix a period during which the author should produce an edition of his book at 1/8 the original price, and if the book is allowed out of print 1 year, the copyright should lapse. End of Remarks on Copyright, read by John Greenman. This is section 82 of Mark Twain Speaking. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Travelogue, Dockside, New York, October 15, 1900. Read by John Greenman. Now that's a long story, but I suppose I must give you something, even if it is in a condensed form. I left America June 6, 1891, and went to Aix-les-Bains, France, where I spent the fall and winter. After that I went to Berlin, where I lectured, giving readings from my works. After this my next stop was the Riviera, where I remained for 3 months, going from there to the Baths near Frankfurt, where I remained during the cholera season. Most of 1892 I spent at Florence, where I rented a home. While there I wrote Joan of Arc and finished up Pudd'nhead Wilson. For the next 2 years I was in France. I can't speak French yet. In the spring of 1895 I came to the United States for a brief stay, crossing the continent from New York to San Francisco, lecturing every night. In October of that year I sailed from Vancouver for Sydney, where I lectured, or more properly speaking, gave readings from my works to the English-speaking people. I also visited Tasmania and New Zealand. This was at the time of the famous Venezuelan message of President Cleveland, and it did my heart good to see that the animosities engendered by that message did not affect the affection of a people in a strange land for me. I then proceeded to India, lecturing in Ceylon, Bombay, and Calcutta. I then sailed for South Africa, arriving at Delagoa Bay in April 1896. In South Africa I visited Kimberley, Johannesburg, and finally Cape Town. I met Paul. I had heard and read all about him. Hat, beard, frock coat, pipe, and everything else. The picture is a true likeness. At this time the Jameson raiders were in jail, and I visited them, and made a little speech trying to console them. I told them of the advantages of being in jail. "This jail is as good as any other," I said, "and, besides, being in jail has its advantages. A lot of great men have been in jail. If Bunyan had not been put in jail he would never have written Pilgrim's Progress. Then the jail is responsible for Don Quixote. So you see, being in jail is not so bad after all." Finally I told them that they ought to remember that many great men had been compelled to go through life without ever having been in a jail. Some of the prisoners didn't seem to take much to the joke, while others seemed much amused. All this time my family was with me, and, after a short stay at Cape Town, we took a steamer for Southampton. On arriving in England we went to Guildford, where I took a furnished house, remaining 2 months, after which for 10 months our home was in London. All this time I was lecturing, reading, or working hard in other ways, writing magazine stories and doing other literary work. After London came Vienna, to which city we went in September 1898, remaining until May of the following year, in order to allow one of my daughters to take music lessons from a man who spelled his name Leschetizky. He had plenty of identification, you see, and withal seemed to be a pretty smart fellow. After Vienna, where, by the way, I had a lot of fun watching the Reichsrath, we returned to London, in which city and Sweden we have been until our departure for home some days ago. And now I am home again, and you have got the history of a considerable part of my life. End of Travelogue, read by John Greenman. This is section 83 of Mark Twain Speaking. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Remarks, Woman's Press Club Tea, Carnegie Hall, New York, October 27, 1900. Read by John Greenman. I was recently asked what I had found striking in this country since my return. I didn't like to say, but what I have really observed is that this is the ungrammatical nation. I am speaking of educated persons. There is no such thing as perfect grammar, and I don't always speak good grammar myself. But I have been foregathering for the past few days with professors of American universities, and I've heard them all say things like this: "He don't like to do it." Oh, you'll hear that tonight if you listen. Or, "He would have liked to have done it." You'll catch some educated American saying that. When these men take pen in hand, they write with as good grammar as any. But the moment they throw the pen aside, they throw grammatical morals aside with it. I quite agree with Mrs. Gaffney, and subscribe to her proposal to boycott all literature which has no right to exist. She must have inspired me out of myself, for to say this means great generosity on my part. I shall not do what I really intended to do, for I was intending to contribute a good deal of this kind of literature myself. He said that various pictures had arisen in his mind, suggested by Mrs. Gaffney, and several musical numbers. I don't know why. I don't see the connection, but there the pictures are. The first of them is at home, in the nursery, when my children were little. The second is of a jail where I once was, by request, not for any crime that I had committed, that they had found out, at least, but to see other people who had committed crimes. And the third picture is one that I saw years ago in a house in New York. Perhaps I am recalled to the first picture by the precocity of your sex in entering the field of literature. You will see it in the family, even in the cradle. On the occasion of which I speak, my daughter, then just out of the cradle, displayed this precocity. Her governess had given her a lesson on the reindeer, which took perhaps an hour. My daughter repeated it to us in a few sentences, possessing decided literary value. This may have come from me, I don't know, but the inaccuracy of these sentences did not come from me. That was original with her. She said, "The reindeer is a very swift animal. A reindeer once drew a sled 400 miles in 2 hours." Then, commenting on it, this was regarded as remarkable. When the reindeer was done drawing that sled 400 miles in 2 hours, it died. Now, there is the whole process of thought, the putting two and two together and drawing a conclusion. My next picture is of the prisoners in the Pretoria jail at the time of the Jameson raid. I soothed the feelings of those prisoners. I told them if they were not in that jail they would probably be in another. I pointed out their great opportunity for concentrating their minds. Sir Walter Raleigh would never have written his great history if he had not been imprisoned in the Tower. Another book written in jail was John Bunyan's Pilgrim's Progress, a book I could have written myself if I had been in jail. I told those prisoners that instead of trying to get out, they should have been paying board in that jail, so great were their opportunities of concentration. As a final instance of the force of limitations in the development of concentration, I must mention that beautiful creature, Helen Keller, whom I have known for these many years. I am filled with the wonder of her knowledge, acquired because shut out from all distraction. If I could have been deaf, dumb, and blind, I also might have arrived at something. I am only sentimentally blind, morally deaf, and sometimes, not always, dumb. No, her grammar isn't perfect. There's no such thing as perfect grammar, but she is as near to it as anyone can be. End of remarks. Read by John Greenman. This is section 84 of Mark Twain Speaking. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. 3 Speeches. New York Press Club reception for Mark Twain, November 12, 1900. Read by John Greenman. And must I always begin with a regret that I have left my gun behind? I've said so many times that if a gentleman introduced me with compliments, then sat down, I'd use a gun. But as I haven't the gun, I'll just give the chairman a dose of his own medicine. It is my privilege to compliment him in return. I ask you to look at him. Gentlemen, you behold before you an old, old man. His features would deceive you. Apparently he is hardened, a person dead to all honest impulses. On these features are the marks of unimaginable crimes, and yet the features belie themselves. Instead of having led a life of crime, as his face indicates, he began in a Sunday school, and will end there. He has always led an exemplary life, one of those lives that make you think of all the long words in the vocabulary that suggest virtue, virtue which he appears to have, but has not. His public history has been merely a deception, milestoned every now and then by misdemeanors. But these misdemeanors were only the effervescences of a great nature, the accidents of a great career. He really has all the virtues known, and he practices them secretly. Gentlemen, you know him too well for me to further prolong this introduction. Joseph I.C. Clarke, who followed, referred to Mark Twain's map of Paris, which showed that the German army had occupied a depleted brewery. At the conclusion of Clarke's talk, Mark Twain arose for his second speech. I rise this time without invitation, in order to defend myself. Colonel Brown: You need it, you need it. Yes, and there are others here older than I who need it more. What I was going to say was this: I don't mind slanders and that sort of thing. The facts are what I object to. I don't want anybody to know my true history, and I appeal to you journalists to keep it from getting abroad. When you live as long as I have, you'll find out that the world knows you much more favorably than you know yourself. I tell you, when you wake up in the morning feeling bad and thinking yourself a pretty low-down kind of a creature, it is not on account of what the world thinks or the slanders of other people, but on account of some infamous deed you have committed and which nobody but yourself knows anything about. Now, the things that those Westerners said about me were all slanders. There was no truth in them. The true things that I did in that region they didn't know, so they couldn't tell them. If they could, they would have put me in a hole. I have not been an alleged humorist. I have been a wise man, a Solomon. I have kept secret the things I have done, but it is no wonder that those people told slanderous tales about me. I would have done the same thing for another man. Mr. Clarke is right in saying that the foundation of humor is seriousness, gravity. Contrast is what brings out humor. To show you that this is true, I will tell you how I came to draw that very map of Paris which he spoke about. It was in 1870 or 1871, I think. In my home was a very sick friend of ours. For days and nights my wife and I sat up and worried. What made the strain worse was the fact that we did not know where to locate the family of our sick friend. In vain we made inquiries to discover what was their post office, so that we might reach them by wire. It was no use, and the strain continued for 3 long weeks. At the end of that time I was completely worn out, exhausted, miserable. Then came the reaction. I sat down and took a big M and made that map of Paris. But when I went to print the map it was upside down. I had forgotten that the cut of a map had to be made reversely in order to have the map look right on paper. The thing that I printed didn't look any more like Paris than like New York. It was a sight to behold. But it was published nevertheless, and some people said it was very humorous. Under it I placed a dozen explanatory notes, but they didn't explain. Then I attached some more notes, without improving the value of the map as a map. But folks said it was funny. Some American students in Berlin took it from one beer mill to another and laughed over it. Then some native Germans got hold of it and talked excited German about it. These Germans saw nothing funny in it, and there was humor in that very fact. Now you can see how a very sad experience resulted in arousing my humor, for if it hadn't been for that sick friend of ours, I would never have drawn the map of Paris. Mr. Hennessy, who followed, said that he had never read any of Mark Twain's books. The next speaker, John W. Keller, said that he had read them all and recommended them to newspapermen as a source of inspiration. Whereupon Mark Twain made his third speech. I want to say good night. Times have changed, you know. I am old. I am reformed, too. I am just as competent to run all night as I ever was, and more competent to discuss Scotch whiskey when it is good, and I see many before me who can do that. But when one becomes respectable, one must go home early. It is to protect my reputation that I am going. The last time I was with you I was like the rest of you, not respectable. All the slanders that were poured upon me tonight, I know, were pure artificialities. The compliments paid me were the only things that had the imprint of truth. I shall take the compliments home and forget the slanders. I have one thing to say before I go. Of all these slanders there's only one that rankles, and it is not a slander on me, but on the man that said it. He said he had never read my books. Now, that hurts. Really, I can't understand it. He seemed so intelligent, so intelligent. But how could he be so, under the circumstances? If he hasn't read those books, his intelligence must be artificial. Mr. Keller has read them, and he simply oozes intelligence. He is brimming over with it. I bid you good night, and thank you very much. End of 3 speeches read by John Greenman. This is section 85 of Mark Twain Speaking. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Introducing Winston S. Churchill, Grand Ballroom, Hotel Waldorf Astoria, New York, December 12, 1900. Read by John Greenman. Mr. Churchill and I do not agree on the righteousness of the South African War, but that is of no consequence. There is no place where people all think alike. Well, there is heaven. There they do, but let us hope it won't be so always. For years I have been a self-appointed missionary, and have wrought zealously for my cause, the joining together of America and the motherland in bonds of friendship, esteem, and affection, an alliance of the heart which should permanently and beneficently influence the political relations of the two countries. Wherever I have stood before a gathering of Americans or Englishmen, in England, India, Australia, or elsewhere, I have urged my mission, and warmed it up with compliments to both countries, and pointed out how nearly alike the two peoples are in character and spirit. They ought to be united. Behold America, the refuge of the homeless, the hunted, the oppressed from everywhere, who can pay $10 admission. Anyone except a Chinaman, standing up for human rights everywhere, even helping to make China admit the foreigner when she didn't want him, and to let him in free when she wanted to charge him $50 if he was a harmless Christian, or kill him if he was a missionary. And how England, mother of human liberty, uttered that great word, "The slave that sets his foot upon English soil is free," and with her strong hand made that gospel good in every acre of that vast empire whose dominions girdle the globe. And how unselfishly England has wrought for the open door for all. And how nobly and piously America also has stood for that same door in all cases where it wasn't her own, and how generous we have been, and how generous England has been in not requiring fancy rates for extinguishing missionaries the way Germany does, but willing to take produce for them, firecrackers and tea, while Germany has to have territory and cash, and monuments, and any other loot that's in reach, and memorial churches, and has thus made true changes of heart and regeneration, and the other details of German Trinity so expensive that China won't be able to afford German missionaries any more till she gets in better shape financially. And how self-respectingly England and America have refrained from imitating German bluster, German rapacity, the mailed fist with a burglar's jimmy in it, and the investing mouth above it, which alternately chortles bargain-counter piety and no quarter according to the state of the market. And how nobly and shamefacedly we both stood timorously by at Port Arthur and wept sweetly and sympathizingly and shone while France and Germany helped Russia to rob the Japanese, and how gallantly we went to the rescue of poor Cuba, friendless, despairing, borne down by centuries of bitter slavery, and broke off her chains and set her free, with approving England at our back in an attitude toward European powers which did us good service in those days, and we confess it now. Yes, as a missionary I have sung this song of praise and still sing it, and yet I think that England sinned in getting into a war in South Africa, which she could have avoided without loss of credit or dignity, just as I think we have sinned in crowding ourselves into a war in the Philippines on the same terms. Mr. Churchill will tell you about the war in South Africa, and he is competent. He fought and wrote through it himself, and he made a record there which would be a proud one for a man twice his age. By his father he is English, by his mother he is American, to my mind the blend which makes the perfect man. We are now on the friendliest terms with England, mainly through my missionary efforts, I suppose, and I am glad. We have always been kin in blood, kin in religion, kin in representative government, kin in ideals, kin in just and lofty purposes, and now we are kin in sin. The harmony is complete. The blend is perfect. Like Mr. Churchill himself, whom I now have the honor to present to you. End of Introducing Winston S. Churchill, read by John Greenman. This is section 86 of Mark Twain Speaking. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Speech. Annual Meeting, Hebrew Technical School for Girls, Temple Emmanuel, New York, January 20th, 1901. Read by John Greenman. Mr. Myers has conducted this matter with distinguished ability, but at the end of this report I noticed a defect. He made such a strong appeal to those people who are going to make their wills. Some of you are here, you know. Such an appeal loosens your purse strings, and you want to give. Well, when he was talking, I thought, now he's going to do it. Why, I'm twice as old as he, and I've had so much experience that I would say to him, when he makes his appeal for help, don't make it for today or tomorrow, but collect the money on the spot. It's a great mistake to get everybody ready to give money and then not pass the hat. We are all creatures of sudden impulse. We must be worked up by steam, as it were. Get them to write their wills now, or it may be too late by and by. Some years ago, in Hartford, we all went to the church on a hot, sweltering night to hear the annual report of Mr. Hawley, a city missionary, who went around finding the people who needed help and didn't want to ask for it. He told of the life in the cellars where poverty resided. He gave instances of the heroism and devotion of the poor. The poor are always good to each other. When a man with millions gives $100,000, it makes a great noise in the world. But he does not miss it. It's noise in the wrong place. It's the widow's mite that makes no noise but does the best work. Well, Hawley worked me up to a great state. I couldn't wait for him to get through. I had $400 in my pocket, and I wanted to give that and borrow more to give. You could see greenbacks in every eye. But he didn't pass the plate, and it grew hotter, and we grew sleepier. My enthusiasm went down, 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 $100 at a time, till finally, when the plate came round, I stole 10 cents out of it. So you see, a neglect like that may lead to crime. Oh, many a time have I thought of that, and regretted it, and I adjure you all to give while the fever is on you. Referring to woman's sphere in life, I'll say that woman is always right. Man has made woman what she is. He has kept her down in her proper place. Your president sits here in that self-satisfied conceit of his, and assumes that I don't know anything about women. Why, I've been in favor of women's rights for years. I see in this school a hope for the realization of a project I have always dreamed of. Why, do you know, when I looked at my gray-haired old mother, with her fine head and noble thoughts, I really almost suspected, toward the last, that she was quite as capable of voting as I was. He's got the wrong notion if he thinks I don't know anything about women. I know that since the women started out on their crusade they have scored in every project they undertook against unjust laws. I would like to see them help make the laws, and those who are to enforce them. I would like to see the whiplash in women's hands. The suffrage in the hands of the men degenerates into a couple of petrified parties. The man votes for his party and gets the city in the condition this one is in now, a disgrace to civilization. If I live 75 years more, well, I won't. 50 years, then, or 25, I think I'll see women use the ballot. It's the possession of the ballot that counts. If women had it, you could tell how they would use it. Bring before them such a state of affairs as existed in New York City today, and they would rise in their strength at the next election, elect a mayor, and sweep away corruption. True, they might sit 10 years and never use it, but on such occasions they would cast it. Or in the case of an unjust war, why, war might even pass away and arbitration take its place. It never will so long as men have the votes. How many of our 600,000 women are vicious? Not enough to amount to anything. If women could vote, each party would feel compelled to put up the best candidate it could, or take the risk of being voted down by the women. States are built on morals, not intellects, and men would never get any morals at all if the women didn't put it into them when they were boys. If women could vote, the good women would all vote one way. Men won't do that. It's a choice of evils with them. He referred to President Meyer's remark that a year earlier the school's board of managers had all been women, but that at present it was all men. And now, he says, they have 21 typewriters, whereas before they had only 4. Oh, I like that modesty. We men are all like that. Well, at any rate, I hope a lot of us will die and leave something in our wills. End of speech, read by John Greenman. This is section 87 of Mark Twain Speaking. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Speech. Annual Meeting, University Settlement Society, New York, February 2nd, 1901. Read by John Greenman. The chairman had just remarked that Mark Twain said the meeting should have adjourned when he was due to speak. As he began his speech, Mark Twain explained. It was because I had nothing to do, and you had. I was thinking of you, for I myself would like to talk for 2 or 3 hours as usual. I was reared to think of others always, never of myself, and I have ever tried to spread that doctrine by proxy. The older we grow, the greater becomes our wonder at how much ignorance one can contain without bursting one's clothes. 10 days ago I did not know anything about the university settlement except what I'd read in the pamphlets sent to me. Now, after being here and hearing Mrs. Hewitt and Mrs. Thomas, it seems to me I know of nothing like it at all. It's a charity that carries no humiliation with it. The speakers before me have told how you have to drive pupils away from your schools instead of into them. It was not that way in my young days. When I came down here this afternoon I saw in the building a dancing class. You must pay a cent for a lesson. You can't get it for nothing. It is well to make people pay for what they get. That is why your charity does not humiliate. By the way, the reason I never learned to dance was because these schools for that art charged money. But it was the pawnbroker's shop you have here that interested me mightily. I have known something about pawnbroker shops in my time, but here you have a wonderful plan. The ordinary pawnbroker is allowed to collect from his patrons an enormous percentage. He fleeces the straggling stranger. I have paid much to them. Just now I saw a man pledge a watch in your shop for $2. He wanted the money only for a fortnight, and the price charged for the loan for that time was only a penny. I wish I could have gotten such terms when I was young. The reason I speak so feelingly on the subject of pawn shops is that I once had a romance which was closely connected with an establishment of the kind. The other day I was looking through that autobiography which I am building for the instruction of the world, when I came across an incident that I had written several years before. It was something that happened in San Francisco a long time ago. At that time I was a newspaper man. I was out of a job. There was a friend of mine, a poet, but as he could not sell his poems, he also had nothing to do for a living, and he was having a hard time of it, too. There was a love passage in it, too, but I will spare you that and leave you to read it in my book. Well, my friend, the poet, said to me that his life was a failure, and I told him I thought it was. And then he said he thought he ought to commit suicide, and I said, all right, which was disinterested advice to a friend in trouble. My advice was positive. It was somewhat disinterested, but there were a few selfish motives behind it. As a reporter, I knew that a good scoop would get me employment, and so I wanted him to kill himself without letting anybody but me know about the deed. Then I could sell the news and get a new start in life. The poet could be spared, and so, largely for his own good and partly for mine, I urged him not to delay in doing the thing. I kept the idea in his mind. You know, there is no dependence in a suicide. He may change his mind. He had a preference for a pistol, which was an extravagance, for we hadn't enough between us to hire a pistol. A fork would have been easier. I told him that as we were financially crippled we could not buy a revolver. Then he wanted a knife. To that I objected, too, on the same grounds. At last he mentioned drowning, and asked me what I thought of it. I said that it was a very good way, except that he was a fine swimmer, and I did not know whether it would turn out well on this account. But I consented to the plan, seeing no better one in sight. So we went down to the beach. I went with him because I wanted to see that the thing was done right. You know the curiosity some people have. When we reached the shore of the sea, a wonderful thing happened. He was all ready to take the fatal leap. I was ready to see him do it. Providence interposed. From out of the ocean, born, perhaps, from the other side of the Pacific, there was washed up on the sand at our feet a gift, a gift that the sea had been tossing around for weeks, maybe, waiting for us to come down to the coast and receive it. What was it? It was a life-preserver. Now, you can imagine the complications that arose. The plan to do the suicide act by the drowning method fell through with a crash. With that life-preserver, you see, he might have stayed in the water for weeks. I couldn't afford to wait that long. Suddenly I had an idea. That was no trouble for me, for I have the habit of having them often. He never had any, especially when he was going to write poetry. I suggested that he pawn the life-preserver and get a revolver. The preserver was a good one. To be sure, the ocean had kept it for us a long time, and it had a few holes in it, but yet it was good enough to pawn somewhere. We sought the pawnbroker. He wanted 10% a month on the loan from the life-preserver. I didn't object, for I never expected to try to get it out again. All I wanted was a revolver, quick. The pawnbroker gave us an old Derringer, which is a kind of pistol that has but one barrel and shoots a bullet as big as a hickory nut. It was the only firearm he would let us have. Then he grew suspicious, wanted to know what we were going to do with the Derringer. I drew him aside. "My friend is a poet," I said, "and he wants to kill himself with it." Upon which he replied, "Oh, well, if he's only a poet, it is well. God speed him." We went out and loaded the pistol. Just then I had some qualms about staying to see the act of my friend. I hadn't objected to witnessing a drowning, but this shooting was different. The drowning might have been looked upon as accidental, but not so with this. But I calmed myself, for when I suggested that I might go away, he grew uneasy and acted as though he would not carry out his purpose if I did not stay beside him. So I stayed. He placed the barrel at his temple. He hesitated. In spite of all I could do, I waxed impatient. "Pull the trigger!" I cried. He pulled it. The ball went clean through his head. I held my breath. Then I found that the bullet had cleaned out all the gray matter. It had made a new man of him. Before he shot that shot he was nothing but a poet. Now he is a useful citizen. The ball just carried the poetic faculty out of the back door. Ever since then, although I am aware that I assisted him in the crime for selfish ends, I have been wishing that I might again help some other poet, or many of them in the same way. Now, therefore, I realize that there's no more beneficent institution than this penny fund of yours, and I want all the poets to know this. I am going to tell all the poets I know where your shop is located. Of course, you have lots of other good things in your establishment besides the pawn shop, and I have been thinking of sending you my check to help along your work, but I have decided instead to send to your library a lot of those books of mine that I hear one of your small boys has dubbed Strawberry Finn. End of speech, read by John Greenman. This is section 88 of Mark Twain Speaking. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Remarks as chairman. Lincoln celebration, benefit of Lincoln Memorial University, Carnegie Hall, New York, February 11, 1901. Read by John Greenman. There remains of my duties as presiding officer on this occasion 2 things to do, only 2, one easy, the other difficult. It is easy to introduce to you the orator of the evening, and then to keep still and give him a chance is the difficult task. To tell an American audience who Henry Watterson is not at all necessary. Just to mention his name is enough. A name like his, mentioned to an audience, would be like one of those blazing sentiments on the Madison Square Tower. Just the mention of his name touches the chords of your memory tenderly and lovingly. Distinguished soldier, journalist, orator, statesman, lecturer, politician, rebel. What is better, he is a reconstructed rebel. Always honest, always noble, always loyal to his confessions, right or wrong, he is not afraid to speak them out. And, last of all, whether on the wrong side or on the right side, he has stood firm and brave because his heart has always been true. It is a curious circumstance, a peculiar circumstance, and it is odd that it should come about, that in the millions of inhabitants of this great city 2 Confederates, one-time rebels, should be chosen for the honorable privilege of coming here and bowing our heads in reverence and love to that honorable soul whom 40 years ago we tried with all our hearts and all our strength to defeat and suppress, Abraham Lincoln. But are not the blue and the gray one today? By these signs we may answer here, yes. There was a rebellion, and we understand it is now closed. I was born and reared in a slave state. My father was a slave owner before the Civil War, and I was a second lieutenant in the Confederate service for a while. Oh, I could have stayed longer. There was plenty of time. The trouble was with the weather. I never saw such weather. I was there, and I have no apologies to offer. But I will say that if this second cousin of mine, Henry Watterson, the orator of the evening, who was born and reared in a slave state, and was a colonel in the Confederate service, had rendered me such assistance as he could, and had taken my advice, the Union armies would never have been victorious. I laid out the whole plan with remarkable foresight, and if Colonel Watterson had carried out my orders, I should have succeeded in my vast enterprise. It was my intention to drive General Grant into the Pacific Ocean, if I could get transportation. If I could have had the proper assistance from Colonel Watterson, it would have been accomplished. I told Watterson to surround the Eastern armies and wait until I came up, but he was insubordinate and stood upon the punctilio of military etiquette and refused to take orders from a second lieutenant of the Confederate army, and so the Union was saved. Now, this is the first time that this secret has ever been revealed. No one outside of the family has known these facts, but they're the truth of how Watterson saved the Union. And to think that up to this very hour that man gets no pension. That's the way we treat people who save Unions for us. There ought to be some blush on the cheek of those present this evening, but to tell the truth, we are out of practice. The hearts of this whole nation, North and South, were in the war. We of the South were not ashamed of the part we took. We believed in those days we were fighting for the right, and it was a noble fight, for we were fighting for our sweethearts, our homes, and our lives. Today we no longer regret the result. Today we are glad that it came out as it did. But we of the South are not ashamed that we made an endeavor. We did our bravest best, against despairing odds, for the cause which was precious to us, and which our consciences approved. And we are proud, and you are proud. The kindred blood in your veins answers when I say it. You are proud of the record we made in those mighty collisions in the fields. When the great conflict began, the soldiers from the North and South swung into line to the tune of that same old melody, "We are coming, Father Abraham, 300,000 strong." The choicest of the young and brave rose up from Maine to the Gulf, went forth to fight and shed their blood under the flag and for what they thought was right. They endured hardships equivalent to circumnavigating the globe 4 or 5 times in the olden days. They suffered untold hardships and fought battles night and day. North and South we put our hearts into that colossal struggle, and out of it came the blessed fulfillment of the prophecy of the immortal Gettysburg speech, which said, "We here highly resolve that these dead shall not have died in vain, that this nation, under God, shall have a new birth of freedom, and that a government of the people, by the people, for the people, shall not perish from the earth." We are here to honor the birthday of the greatest citizen and the noblest and the best, after Washington, that this land or any other land has yet produced. The old wounds are healed, and you of the North and we of the South are brothers again. We consider it an honor to be of the soldiers who fought for the lost cause. And now we consider it a high privilege to be here tonight and assist in laying our humble homage at the feet of Abraham Lincoln, and in forgetting that you of the North and we of the South were ever enemies, and remembering only that we are now indistinguishably fused together and nameable by one common great name, Americans. End of Remarks as Chairman. Read by John Greenman. This is section 89 of Mark Twain Speaking. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Remarks on Osteopathy. Committee on Public Health, New York General Assembly, Albany, February 27, 1901. Read by John Greenman. Prior to speaking, Mark Twain endured attacks from several doctors who were opposed to the proposed osteopathy bill. Dr. Van Fleet is the gentleman who gave me the character. I have heard my character discussed 1,000 times before you were born, sir, and shown the iniquities in it, and you did not get more than half of them. Now, gentlemen of the committee, when I came here, I came with a purpose of some kind, but it is difficult for me to find out now just what it was. These debaters have knocked it all out of my head. They have put my mind in a sort of maze with their scientific terms. I must say that I was both touched and distressed when they brought out that part of a child. I suppose the object of it was to prove that you cannot take a child apart in that way, and I suppose we must concede that they have proved that. Why, sir, when I listened to all those remarkable names of diseases which our learned medical friends have thrown out to us here this afternoon, it made me envious of the man who had them all. I don't suppose I shall ever enjoy the felicity of having them all in the span of life allotted to me, but I am truly thankful for those I have had. I am an experimenter. I have had a number of diseases, but am willing to take more, but I want to distribute them among not only doctors, but the mountebanks. I am so constituted that I want to give everybody a chance. I want to give the mountebank a chance, if you please, and I do not want to have any restrictions put upon my free will when I have that disposition. I could not stand here and advocate osteopathy without knowing much more about it than I do. One of the gentlemen who spoke referred to my having acquired such knowledge of osteopathy as I had in Sweden. That is true. About a year and a half ago in London I met Mr. Kellgren, who I believe is the most noted practitioner of this kind abroad. He calls himself Mr. because he has not acquired the privilege of giving a certificate when a patient dies on his hands. He has been practicing in London for 27 years. My meeting with him was quite by chance. I heard of him through a friend of mine whom he had cured of dysentery after eminent physicians had failed to give any relief, and after my friend had been brought close to the point of death. The friend I speak of is Pulteney Bigelow. Now, of course, there may have been some flaw in Mr. Bigelow's cure, but he seemed to me to have been restored to full strength and health, and he himself insisted that he was. I thought he ought to know, though doubtless our medical friends will not agree with me on that point. Now, I am always wanting to try everything that comes along. It doesn't matter much what it is, I want to try it. And so I went to Mr. Kellgren, was treated by him in London and later on in Switzerland, and he did me a lot of good, as I thought, although I must admit that my education doesn't qualify me to say just when I am in good health. I see in the Bell Anti-Christian Science Bill that you permit the grandmother to continue to dose the babe. Well, you couldn't stop her. It is well that you put in that provision. As a matter of fact, we all know that our population is really divided in allegiance between two schools of medicine, the regular physicians and the grandmothers. Now, all I ask is the same liberty you give to the grandmother. The grandmother has been practicing without a license as far as the memory of any one of us goes back, and on the whole her success has been such that the medical profession is willing to have her continue in practice. I like full liberty to do with my body as I like, to my own peril, or to the peril of anyone else. It doesn't matter. I'm not particular as to that. The state stands for liberty, and it doesn't seem likely to change its position and will not interfere with your soul in the matter of health. When my soul is sick, unlimited spiritual liberty is given me by the state. Now then, it doesn't seem logical that the state shall depart from this great policy the health of the soul, and change about and take the other position in the matter of smaller consequence, the health of the body. Now, the Bell Bill will drive all the osteopaths out of the state. I suppose if you do drive them out, they will go up to Vermont, which has been characterized as the garbage ground of the profession, and which, since it became that, has also become one of the healthiest states in the Union, and I suppose I can go up there without much trouble. Then you create the same condition as existed in the Garden of Eden. You want something, and it is forbidden. Adam probably didn't want the apple until he found he couldn't have it, just as he would want an osteopath. He was different from the Clemens flock, especially this one. I wouldn't have taken one apple, but the whole crop. I believe we ought to retain all of our liberties. We can't afford to throw any of them away. They didn't come to us in a night, like Jonah's gourd, if Jonah was the man who had a gourd. The moment you start to drive anybody out of the state, then you have the same situation which existed in the Garden of Eden. I don't know as I cared much about these osteopaths until I heard you were going to drive them out of the state, but since I heard that I haven't been able to sleep. Now, what I contend is that my body is my own, at least. I have always so regarded it. If I do it harm through my experimenting, it is I who suffer, not the state. And if I indulge in dangerous experiments, the state don't die. I attend to that. I hold my mother responsible for my desire for experiment. She bought any patent medicine that came along, whether she would need it or not, and would try any new disease that happened to be around. She experimented on me. I didn't enjoy it then, but I do now. When my mother heard of a new cure, she didn't select one from the flock haphazardly. No, she chose judiciously, and chose the one she could spare, which was myself. I can remember well when the cold water cure was first talked about. I was then about 9 years old, and I remember how my mother used to stand me up naked in the back yard every morning and throw buckets of cold water on me just to see what effect it would have. Personally, I had no curiosity upon the subject. And then, when the dousing was over, she would wrap me up in a sheet wet with ice water, and then wrap blankets around that and put me into bed. I never realized that the treatment was doing me any particular good physically, but it purified me spiritually, for pretty soon after I was put into bed I would get up a perspiration that was something worth seeing. Mother generally put a life-preserver in bed with me, and when finally she let me out and unwound the sheet, I remember that it was all covered with yellow color, but that was only the outpourings of my conscience, just spiritual outpourings, and, fortunately, it removed all that, so that I am not troubled with it now. But I am willing to say that sometimes my mother's experiments had such an effect upon me that she was obliged to call in that ministering angel with the pills to bring me around, and remembering that, I do not bar allopathy in my experiments now. No, I am willing to take a chance at that just for old time's sake. My mother 3 times tried new remedies on me, and they left me so low that they had to pull me out by means of the family doctor. I like osteopathy. It is quicker, and you don't have to take any medicine. So I want liberty to do as I choose with my physical body and experiment as much as possible. The physicians think they are moved by regard for the best interests of the public. Isn't there a little touch of self-interest back of it all? It seems to me there is, and I don't claim to have all the virtues, only 9 or 10 of them. I was born in the Banner State, and by Banner State I mean Missouri. I was born there, and so was osteopathy. And both of us are getting along reasonably well, I trust. But in my state then the word dispute meant quarreling, and quarreling in anger. Neither did we know of any other kind of a doctor than the one who went around carrying his pills in his saddlebag. Well, one day my father took me to my uncle's house, and he had a picture on the wall of a room showing Christ disputing with the doctors. Now, although I was the model Sunday school boy of our section, I couldn't quite understand that, for to my mind to dispute meant to quarrel. There was an old slave in the house, Uncle Ben by name, who came into the room when I was revolving the problem of the picture in my mind. I thought perhaps Uncle Ben might be able to enlighten me, for he was a sort of doctor himself, a herb doctor, unlicensed, of course. "Uncle Ben," I asked him, "what does that picture mean? Christ surely didn't begin the dispute, did he?" "No, the doctors, they begin it," he said. "And what did they want to quarrel with Christ for?" "'Cause he ain't got no license. That's why they say he bust them up in business." That is it. The objection is, people are curing people without a license, and you are afraid it will bust up business. You ought to compromise, so you can all get a chance at these people around here. End of Remarks on Osteopathy, read by John Greenman. This is section 90 of Mark Twain Speaking. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Training That Pays. Monthly Supper, Male Teachers Association, Hotel Albert, New York, March 16, 1901. Read by John Greenman. We cannot all agree. That is most fortunate. If we could all agree, life would be too dull. I believe if we did all agree, I would take my departure before my appointed time. That is, if I had the courage to do so. I do agree in part with what Mr. Skinner has said. In fact, more than I usually agree with other people. I believe that there are no private citizens in a republic. Every man is an official. Above all, he is a policeman. He does not need to wear a helmet and brass buttons, but his duty is to look after the enforcement of the laws. If patriotism had been taught in the schools years ago, the country would not be in the position it is in today. Mr. Skinner is better satisfied with the present conditions than I am. I would teach patriotism in the schools, and teach it this way. I would throw out the old maxim, "My country, right or wrong," and instead I would say, "My country when she is right." I would not take my patriotism from my neighbor or from Congress. I should teach the children in the schools that there are certain ideals, and one of them is that all men are created free and equal. Another, that the proper government is that which exists by the consent of the governed. If Mr. Skinner and I had to take care of the public schools, I would raise up a lot of patriots who would get into trouble with him. I should also teach the rising patriot that if he ever became the government of the United States and made a promise, that he should keep it. I will not go any further into politics, as I would get excited, and I don't like to get excited. I prefer to remain calm. I have been a teacher all my life, and never got a cent for teaching. Times. The speaker then cited some incidents from his boyhood life which, he said, he had later incorporated in his books. The fence whitewashing incident in Tom Sawyer, he said, brought him in $4,000 in the end, when he never expected to get anything for teaching the other boys how to whitewash, way back in 1849. I have a benevolent faculty. It does not always show, but it is there. We have had some millionaires who gave money to colleges. Now we have Mr. Carnegie building 65 new libraries. There is an educator for you on a large scale. I was going to do it myself, but when I found out it would cost over $5 millions, I changed my mind, as I was afraid it would bankrupt me. When I found out Mr. Carnegie was going to do it, I told him he could have my idea gratis. I said to him, "Are the books that are going to be put into the new libraries on a high moral plane?" If they are not, I told him he had better build the libraries and I would write the books. With the wealth I would get out of writing the books, I could build libraries and then he could write books. I am glad that Mr. Carnegie has done this magnificent thing, and as the newspapers have suggested, I hope that other rich men will follow his example and continue to do so until it becomes a habit they cannot break. End of Training That Pays. Read by John Greenman. This is section 91 of Mark Twain Speaking. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Dinner Speech. Lotus Club Dinner for Governor Benjamin B. Odell, Jr., New York, March 23, 1901. Read by John Greenman. I lately had the pleasure and the honor of visiting Governor Odell on matters of public business in his political home in the State House, in the bosom of his political family, the legislature, a family made up in the proportion of 3 Republicans for business to 1 Democrat for ornament and social elevation. I went up there without salary to plead against the reduction, the proposed reduction, of the citizens' liberties, and to vote against the Ramapo bill in the Senate if I could get a chance to enter upon the floor of the House and to introduce a police bill, not because they were running short of police bills, and if the governor would promise to sign it, my bill would pass. I am privileged on the floor of the House anywhere in all the legislative bodies in the world, a thing that happened by accident rather than merit. I wanted to introduce that police bill. It seemed to me that it was a very good idea. Now, it was not like any other police bill that has ever been introduced anywhere. There was a little self-interest in it, here and there, and my scheme was to have none but authors on the police. Let us abolish policemen who carry clubs and revolvers, and put in a squad of poets, armed to the teeth with poems on spring and love. Well, for myself, I wanted to be the chief of police, not because I thought I was really qualified for the place, but because I was tired and wanted a rest. I wanted Mr. Howells for first deputy, not because Mr. Howells knows anything about those things, but because he was tired too. A lot of us authors are tired, and now that Mr. Depew has published speeches and other books and has become an author, I wanted him for second deputy, not because he is tired, because he isn't, but because he is one of those men who do all things well, and he could run the police business and I could take the salary. And besides, more than that, he and I have a tie. Indeed, we are members of the celebrated class of '53 of Yale, only he was there before I was. And another thing, he is a Missourian, like me, and in the Missourians there is no guile, and there is a nearer tie still. When I was born I was a member of a firm of twins, and one of them disappeared, and it has been borne in upon me of late that the personal resemblance between Depew and me, and the general handsome style and grace of form and figure, and things of that sort, and activity of speech, and, well, it proves to me that that long-lost twin is here. Well, I wanted Stedman, and Aldrich, and Brander Matthews, and Crawford, and Cable for the Broadway squad, and others for the red light district, and others still to take care of the pretty manicurists, and to modify the activities of the cadets. Now, Depew could do that. If my bill passed, I'd just fill up the red light district with poets, the best people we've got, armed not with barbaric clubs, but with their own poems, and I would make them corral those poor unkempt people of that locality, and I would have my poetic policemen read their poems to them until that region was so elevated and uplifted and reformed that the inhabitants over there themselves wouldn't know it. I would assign the most soulful poets to that district, all heavily armed with their poems. I would station them on the corners after they had rounded up all the depraved people of the district so they could not escape, and then have them read from their poems to the poor unfortunates. The plan would be very effective in causing an emigration of the depraved elements. Now, that bill I drew myself. That was my dream. It was my hope, my ambition, but it failed like so many bright dreams in this disappointing world. Governor Odell wouldn't favor it. He said that authors were well enough in their place, but he said it wouldn't do for me to leave the city unprotected. Now that remark was irrelevant. It wasn't discreet. The very thing I was trying to do was to protect the city. He said the authors, as police, that it would be worse than Ramapo, but I can't agree with him. Ramapo is authorized to bring on a water famine. Authors never do that. Well, I shall never forget to be grateful to the legislature up there for the hospitalities extended to me, and for the chance that I had to hear a reverend gentleman speak from his impromptu speech, which he read from typewritten manuscript, and in which he did for me again what has been done so often before, blasted my character, what was left of it. He said that if I had my just deserts I would not be a guest there. I should be a guest somewhere else maybe, or be dangling from a lamp post somewhere. He was telling about the last time that I broke jail, and said that I carried off several pairs of boots belonging to other folks. This statement was a lie, only that, and he knew that perfectly well. He was there a guest in that place, and so was I, and he was so interested in drawing my character in the past, although he came there to absolutely obliterate me before the people. He hadn't anything personal against me, except that I was opposed to the political war, and he said I was a traitor and didn't go to fight in the Philippines. That doesn't prove anything. That doesn't prove a man is a traitor. Where's the evidence? There are 75 millions of us working our patriotism. He did the same thing himself. It would be an entirely different question if the country's life was in danger, its existence at stake. Then, that is one kind of patriotism. We would all come forward and stand by the flag, and stop thinking about whether the nation was right or wrong. But when there is no question that the nation is in any way in danger, but only some little war away off, then it may be that on the question of politics the nation is divided, half patriots and half traitors, and no man can tell which from which. End of dinner speech read by John Greenman.